All right, we just finished taking a quiz over Egypt. Hopefully you remembered everything you needed to remember and did well on that. Now we're going to move to the next phase because remember the children of Israel left Egypt and eventually they ended up where? In the land of Canaan. So we're going to look at what happened in the land of Canaan, who were the people living there. And of course we're going to back up a little bit from when the Israelites first arrived. So we're going to start with, in your notes you'll see the early inhabitants of the land of Canaan. And we're going to go look through a bunch of names that some may sound familiar and some may not. But there are names that are given to different people that live there. There were a number of different people that inhabited the land, coming in and out. Some of them were nomadic. They came in for a while, they would go somewhere else. But here are some of the names that you might even see in the biblical records. So we have the Rephaim. By the way, anytime you see an I am on the end of a Hebrew word, that indicates plurality. So, can you think of a word that has "im" on the end of it from the Bible? Maybe you've heard of cherubim. You ever heard the word cherubim or seraphim? That means it's a plurality. A cherub would be one. Cherubim is a group of them, okay? So we have the Rephaim. Now these, interestingly, are aboriginal giants. These are men that are much bigger than anyone else. And they lived in Canaan, in Edom, which is southeast of Canaan, Moab, which is that general same direction as well. One of the people that we have named in Deuteronomy chapter 3 is Og, who is the king of Bashan. And he is among those Rephaim. When we talk about giants, there are a number of times in the Bible where we see people referenced as giants. Who's the most famous giant of all? Goliath, right? Well, it's interesting that in the different places where people have dug, paleontologists looking for fossils, whatever, that sometimes they have found large bones from humans, indicating that some of these humans were extremely tall, 9, 10, 13 feet tall. But you'll never see them in museums. You know why? You hide them away. They don't want anybody to know that they actually have those bones. Now, why would they do that?
Because it proves that the Bible is true. Somebody calls it the Bible is true.
Yeah, it shows that the Bible is true, that there were giants that lived long ago. And it just kind of goes against the modern thinking about evolution, that we are getting bigger and bigger as we go along. We're getting better and better and smarter and smarter. Well, here are people that lived a long time ago that were much bigger than we are today. So that's just something to keep in mind when you go to a museum. All right, so we have the Rephaim. We have the Zuzim. That's a fun name. You know, what family are you in? Oh, I'm a Zuzim, a Zuzumite, or whatever. However you can say that. The Zamzuzumim. That's in Genesis 14. We have the Emim, the Horim. Notice the Em on the end. Sometimes called the Horites or Hurrians. Genesis 36. We have the Avim and the Anakim. There's another family of giants we find in Numbers and Joshua. And we have the Amorites that we have already seen. These are the same people that were in Mesopotamia earlier. Remember, the old Babylonian kingdom were made up of Amorites. Well, they also find their way over into Egypt, where they're called what? The Amorites that invade Egypt during the second intermediate period are called what? The Hyksos. They also come into the land of Canaan. So the Amorites get around. They're in a number of different places. All right, and then we come into the period called, well, let's look at where some of these are. We'll come to the patriarchal period. Let's go to that. In this period, people are starting to settle down more. That many years after the flood, they're settling in. There are towns being built, civilization. And these are the tribes of what's called the patriarchal period. Do you remember what the patriarchal period means? That's the time of the patriarchs. What are the patriarchs? What's the word patriarch mean? It means fathers. Time of the fathers. And for the Israelite people, that would include who's considered the father of the Hebrew people? No, long before Moses. Long before Joseph. Abraham. So when we talk about the patriarchs, we talk about Abraham and his son, Isaac and his sons, Jacob and Esau. So that's the patriarchal period, and that's of course covered in primarily the book of Genesis. And so that's the time period here. So that's what we've backed up a little bit. So the word Canaanites is used in the Old Testament, in Genesis, for example, and it might refer to any one of these groups. Just generally, anybody living in that land could be called a Canaanite, even though they weren't technically from the tribe of Canaan. All right, so here's some of the people that lived there. We have Phoenicians, and we'll talk more about them in particular. Some of them controlled the area of Jerusalem. They called it Jebus. They control the area of Megiddo and the city of Byblos, which is over here on the coast. We've talked about before, I think. Also, Gezer, Hamath, Beth Shan. We find them mentioned in the book of Numbers 13, as well as some other places. Then we have the Philistines. You've heard the Philistines, right? The Philistines were fighting against, primarily, who do you know that was fighting against the Philistines? David. Anybody else? Before him, King Saul. So they were enemies around that time. The Philistines originally came from Crete, and they seemed to enjoy a monopoly on iron. They knew how to make iron weapons, which they got from the Hittites who lived up in this area. And then down here, the Philistines had control over that. They weren't allowed to make anything out of iron without their permission. So that made it hard for people to have weapons to use against the Philistines, because the Philistines were the ones that had the iron weapons. And we find that mentioned in Amos, 1 Samuel, other places. Then we have the Ammonites, who are descendants of Ammon. Then we have the Hittites, which lived up in this area primarily. The Hittites were sons of Heth. They are mentioned with Abram in Genesis 23, and also mentioned a couple other places in Genesis. They're found in the mountains in the book of Numbers, and so there's several references in the Bible to the Hittites. Then we have the Jebusites here. They were the ones that lived primarily in Jerusalem. They're the ones that controlled over that city. Their king was killed by Joshua, and it was occupied by the Jebusites, Jerusalem was, until David conquered it in 2 Samuel 5. And then he changes the name to Jerusalem. Now we have the Amorites, as we mentioned before, and they were Semitic, which means they're relatives of whom? Who were the Semites that we know a lot about? They would be descendants of Shem. Who else are descendants of Shem that we're in which we're particularly interested? Any other descendants of Shem that we know about? Were relatives of the Amorites? That when they were in Egypt were relatives of the Amorites, and so were enslaved when the Hyksos were kicked out. Who could that be? I wonder. Who might it be that were enslaved in Egypt that were descendants of Shem?
Hebrews.
What? Hebrews. The Hebrews. Are you sure? Yes, the Hebrews are Semites as well. So a lot of these different groups that are there in the land of Canaan are descendants of Ham, but the Amorites are descendants of Shem. They're Semitic. And they're mentioned a bunch of times in the Old Testament. Then we have the Hivites, sometimes called Horites. They're in Genesis and Joshua. We had the Girgasites. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? In Joshua 24. And the Perizzites, not parasites, Perizzites are villagers that are in the Bible as well. Now, as I said, all these people were generally black people. They were descendants of Ham, except for the Amorites. In fact, when Sennacherib of Assyria came down into this area, Assyria up in here, came down into here, he referred to the conquered people as blackness of head people. In other words, people with black heads. Well, I couldn't see the rest of their bodies, so you didn't know what the rest of them were. But you knew they had black heads. All right? So, the land of Canaan is primarily black people. That would include the descendants of Canaan as well, because Canaan was the son of Ham. All right. Next we come to the golden age of Palestine, or the land of Canaan. And that was brought in by the Hyksos. So these Amorites that invaded Egypt also brought a higher civilization to the land of Canaan. They brought in a city-state system. So in other words, they built up cities, and then each city was its own government. So each city ran its own affairs. They might sometimes ally themselves with other cities, but each city ran itself. That's what's the city-state. And we've seen that before over in Sumer and as well as other places. So then we come to the northwest coast, the area of Phoenicia, which would be along here, blown up. It's this area here. And that became a cultural center. In other words, there was the civilization kept advancing there, and whenever you have civilization advancing, you oftentimes have culture. That is, more time spent on the arts, music, things like that. And the major cities of Phoenicia, where this cultural increase takes place, would include Tyre, right here, Sidon, which you maybe can't see real well here, and Byblos. Those are the three port cities of Phoenicia. They become major cities, major ports. All right? Now, as we move along, what happens to the Hyksos in Egypt? They're driven out. So what do you think happens to the Hyksos in the land of Canaan? Same thing. Egypt not only drives them out of Egypt, but also continues so that Egypt takes control over this area as well as over Egypt. And so Egypt has control of the land of Canaan at the time when the Exodus takes place. Egypt controls all of Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, what's called today, and up into the land of Canaan. Egypt was a major world power. But remember, we said that they lost power after the Exodus. Remember, they got letters from people up here saying, help us, because the Hebrew are invading, and Egypt couldn't help because they had lost so much when they lost their army in the Red Sea. So we did at one time have Egyptian dominance. They took over from the Hyksos governmental system and established a form of feudalism. Are you familiar with feudalism? If you know that term, it's where you have a lord that owns land, and then people work for him on his land. They're serfs. That's what was dominant in Europe for several centuries, and this is the kind of system that they established. So no longer are these great cultural centers. There no longer are there great civilizations there, but it's dividing up the land among Egyptians or people that are working for the Egyptians. And in that kind of a system, all they're doing is using the land. And so they drained the country. They used it instead of cultivating it. They didn't try to make the land better. They just took whatever they could from it for Egypt. So Egypt was draining the country of everything it had because all they were interested in was tribute. All they wanted was to get money from the people that they conquered. They weren't interested in bettering their lives or making Canaan any better. They're just taking. And so then this becomes a time of decline for Canaan. They no longer have the civilization, the culture that they had under the Hyksos or the Amorites that were there. Okay, next we move then to another empire that comes into existence, and that's the Hittite Empire. You can see on the map where they are, and they also then influence down into the area of Canaan. So they're going to be important as well. The Hittite Empire, well, let's see, let's go to the next one. You can see that they expanded over this direction down this way, and you can see that with the Egyptian Empire coming up this direction, that there was eventually conflict between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And that culminated in a battle under Ramses II. Do you remember us talking about Ramses II coming up and fighting a battle against the Hittites at a place called Kadesh? And so they fought there. And does anybody remember what the outcome of that battle was? Zach?
Peace treaty.
A peace treaty. And the first peace treaty in history between two countries. All right, so that, of course, the land of Canaan is still under rule of the Egyptians, but they have fought against the Hittites and reached a stalemate there. All right, now let's move along then to the Phoenicians. How many of you have heard of the Phoenicians before? Have you had that in the previous class? Only one or two of you? All right, well, this would be first-time interest, hopefully, for you. The Phoenicians. Phoenicia is this area right along here. You can see where Jerusalem is down here. Here's the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, Nazareth right there, Samaria down here. Well, up this direction, northwest of the land of Israel, that would become Israel, is Phoenicia. And here again are their main cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. They are the merchants of the Mediterranean. They expanded quite a bit after the time of David. The good coastline along there helped them to be encouraged to move out onto the sea. So they became sailors. They sailed all around the Mediterranean. Tyre, in fact, was so well defended that they had an island off the coast of Tyre that anytime an enemy came, they could just move everything out to the island and nobody could get them. So that seemed pretty good. We'll see how that works out. They had a great harbor at Tyre as well, and so they were well defended. They were so prosperous that they founded colonies. So not only did they sail all around the Mediterranean Sea, and I think they sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean, maybe even down around Africa, possibly even to America. They were that good as sailors. But they established a colony over here in Carthage. So we'll find out Carthage has a big role to play in history, and they were founded by Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians became the greatest merchants of their day. The use of iron that they got from the Hittites enabled them to acquire and employ timber from Lebanon. Lebanon was known for its forests, and with iron axes, they were able to chop down trees more easily than without them. They used the iron to saw them up, and so lumber became a way for them to build ships, and then they also sold lumber around the Mediterranean, wherever they went. So they made use of two valuable natural resources, timber, and also another resource was purple dye. Timber and purple dye were the two primary natural resources that they traded around the Mediterranean. Now, where did they get the purple dye? We saw that they got the lumber from the forests of Lebanon. Where do they get purple dye? The purple dye shop, right? Anybody know where purple dye came from? How many of you know what a mollusk is? A mollusk. It's a sea creature that, let's see, a clam would be a form of mollusk, I believe. So a mollusk is a sea creature. Well, there's a particular kind of mollusk called a murex, which somebody discovered this, that when you squeeze it, you get a drop of liquid, which if you get enough drops, you can use for purple dye. I suppose when you squeeze it, I don't know if that's his blood or what it is coming out, but each one you get a drop. So, if you're going to dye a whole garment purple, how many of those murex, these mollusks, would you need? A lot, right? Each one you get one drop. Here's another one at the top. So that means that it's very difficult to get that many. It's also very labor intensive. You've got a lot of people squeezing a lot of them to make the purple dye, which makes purple dye very expensive. That's why normally only kings wore purple. You know purple is associated with kings, right? That's why, because it was so expensive. Well, the Phoenicians were the ones that carried purple dye throughout the Mediterranean, along with timber. In addition, they specialized in manufacturing 3 kinds of glass. So here we see the axe made out of iron they used, the dagger. Here's the murex that they used to squeeze out the purple dye. And here's cloth with purple dye on it. Now here are different kinds of glass that they use. They specialize in 3 kinds of glass. Now, anybody know what glass is made from?
Sand.
From sand, yeah. And did they have sand along their beaches? Yeah. And somebody figured out how to make glass out of it. So they made 3 kinds. They made transparent, colorless glass, transparent, colorless, which would be used for mirrors and common objects like vases, urns, bottles, and jugs. The next kind of glass they made was semi-transparent, colored glass. So they made transparent, colorless, and then semi-transparent, colored glass. The most beautiful objects produced by the Phoenicians, in fact, and they consisted of small flasks or bottles that were probably intended to contain perfumes, small jugs, small vases that were pointed at the lower extremity, like this. They're colored with either longitudinal or horizontal stripes and bands, often with zigzags. And then opaque glass. What's opaque? Opaque means you can't see any light through it. And that would be like porcelain with coloring obtained from using metallic oxides. So these are some of the major products that they traded throughout the Mediterranean. Now we have one more object to talk about, but the bell's going to ring, and so we'll talk about one more object tomorrow, and then another contribution the Phoenicians made to civilization. Don't forget about your assignment to read pages 34 to 39, fill in notes as you go.